hope you're doing well. Today we have a new painting tutorial of this dark night forest with some glimmering lights. This was supposed to be a pretty simple painting, but then it kinda escalated on the way, so I'm trying to take things slow and make this a little bit longer tutorial. I'm using a B5 size watercolor sketchbook, and we are turning the page to create a horizontal painting for a change. With gouache, the paper quality doesn't matter that much, so whatever thicker paper you own will probably work. We'll start by doing a rough pencil sketch that will guide us through the beginning part of the painting. I'll be using this dark green colored pencil, but all these sketches will be covered entirely, so it doesn't matter what type of pencil you use here. I first outlined the painting size roughly. I didn't want to go all the way from side to side here, so I cropped the area a little bit more sideways. I also didn't bother with clean outlines this time, so I'm just adding these 2 clips to the corners to prevent the paper from buckling instead of lining this area with tape. But when it comes to the actual sketch, I'm starting by drawing the horizon line, which in this picture is slightly lower than the midpoint of the painting. This painting will be pretty top heavy, so having enough space for the sky part will balance the painting slightly more. So for this sketch, I'm mainly going to focus on these trees, and especially this one bigger kind of curved tree that will be the main focus point of the painting. Again, all of this is pretty much going to be covered by the first few layers, but I think it still helps to have this sort of plan ahead, and you could always, for example, take a picture of this sketch that you can still refer to later. But after that, we can start the actual painting process. I'm using my Holbein Gouache Paints, but you don't need the exact colors or paints from the same brand to achieve this look. You will need to have some sort of green, blue and yellow shades, and then we'll need some brown for the trees, and of course black and white to mix with all the colors. If your colors are pretty close to mine, you won't need to blend as much, but for example, if you have a lighter green, you'll just need to mix more black or dark blue with it throughout the painting. We'll start from all the background layers, which I think are quite important since we're trying to create a pretty layered, dark, mysterious appearance. I'm using this medium-sized flat brush for all these first steps, which will speed up the process a bit. We'll first mix this lighter, very grayish blue shade that goes in the very center of this painting, which is the most highlighted part of the whole background. So this is pretty much the lightest color we're gonna use for a while, and we are immediately starting to darken things up by adding more of the black and blue shades into the paint mixture, and then we can just start sweeping these colors towards the edges of the painting, gradually making them darker. I decided to cover most of the smaller trees from my sketch and only go around these 2 bigger trees in the front part of the painting. You don't need to leave these visible either, but drawing these long branches at the top was a bit tricky, so I felt like leaving them visible would help later. I'm also not blending much here before we've managed to fill the whole sky area with color, but when we reached that point, I started to blend the colors together a little bit. Blending with gouache paints is quite tricky and might require some practice, but what I like to do is clean the brush from any excess paint and also squeeze out most of the water from the brush and then start to just blend between the colors, mainly using some circular motions. If the brush is too wet, this might create a bit of a mess, so I think the key to this technique is to use a nearly dry brush and blend until the brush is so dry that it doesn't move the colors anymore. And that's when you add the slightest bit of more water and then repeat this process. I'm also using very light pressure while I do this and sometimes barely touch the paper with my brush. So yeah, I know this looks a little bit messy for now, but it's totally okay. The background does not need to be completely smooth. So after the sky is done, we will do the same thing for the ground. I wanted the ground to have a slightly more green tone overall. So we're mixing more of the lighter green and black again to deepen the colors. First, we're just adding these pretty quick and sloppy layers to cover most of the background. And I'm also trying to use a few different shades and add a few darker areas here and there, pretty much using pure black. You might have noticed that I outlined some areas from the ground in the sketching phase, and these are the places where I'll add a little bit darker color to add more dimension and movement to the ground. I especially wanted the front part of the ground to be dark because there's no light source around there, but otherwise you can place the darker areas pretty freely because those will mostly just resort to some height differences and shapes on the forest floor. Then we're blending again using the same technique as before. One thing I also tried to create here was this almost gradual fade from the sky to the ground. So I wanted the forest to look dark and almost mistier in the distance, which also simultaneously adds more focus to the things at the front of the painting that we want to keep more detailed and sharp. I know the background still looks very messy at this point, but it will all slowly start to come together. So next, we're gonna start painting the trees. You can probably guess that we are beginning to use some of the brown colors that we also already added to the pathway on the ground. I switched to a round brush that is still on the bigger side, and we'll start by covering the final white areas here, which are the biggest trees in this painting. I started with very dark colors here because I feel like it's often easier to add light colors on top of dark ones when using gouache paints. Then I'll make a slightly lighter brown color towards the sides of the trees that face the center of the painting. So the light source in this one is going to be here in the middle, which means that the outer edges will have the darkest shadows. Again, we're gonna keep adding more and more layers, so the trees definitely don't need to look perfect at this point. And then I also started to paint some thinner trees in the background, and I was trying to use a little bit lighter colors here at first, but we are actually going to darken up these trees later as well. This step took me quite a while and few tries because I wanted to start very slowly and not go too dark too fast, but eventually I realized that we needed quite dark shadows for this painting to make the glimmering lights we're gonna add later really pop. Again, I generally used darker colors on the edges and then kept the trees here in the middle a little bit lighter. Then you can start adding some shapes and strokes using those similar tones we've used here on the trees to the area where the ground meets the trees to start to add some definition or, I don't know, indication of some plants or bushes in the distance. Throughout this whole painting, I'm not using any special techniques, so this is mostly just layering and tapping motions and then using the blending technique with a drier brush. After a while, we can also start adding some leaves towards the top part of the painting. Again, I tried to start with lighter colors and later realized I really needed to darken things up to create more contrast. A lot of these leaves will actually be covered later, so just adding some shadows or blurry shapes will be just fine. You don't need to worry about creating any individual leaf shapes. After that, we're jumping back to the crown again and starting to define the areas here a little bit more. So again, I'm starting by adding lots more shadows here with pretty much pure black, because this is pretty much the point where I realized that I needed to darken up this painting a lot to create a very high contrast. My goal was to really make the lights look like they are lighting up the areas around them. So you can imagine a candle burning in an otherwise dark room and how it's going to create very heavy shadows to any shapes around it. Versus a candle burning in a room which is not entirely dark, when it's gonna have much less of an impact. I hope this makes sense, but this was kind of my thought process here. So we really needed these completely black areas to create a very dark, gloomy forest. Again, while I'm working on this crown part, I'm not always adding more paint. So a lot of this is just blending the existing colors with quite a dry brush to create that more soft blended appearance. This is a look that I personally enjoy, but I know there are definitely many different styles when it comes to gouache paints. So having way more defined color blocks might also give a very interesting look to a painting like this. Also, I sometimes get comments and wishes that I would slow down these painting tutorials even more, and I really understand that it might be difficult to see what I'm doing here at times, but this painting took me, I'd say, around 4 hours in real time, so I will need to speed up the process slightly to fit the whole thing into one video. I've also asked my audience a few times, either on YouTube or Instagram, what length painting tutorials they like to watch the most, and the majority of people prefer shorter tutorials or tutorials from 20 to 40 minutes long. So while I understand that having, for example, a real-time tutorial would benefit some people, I really try to find a balanced in-between solution, but sometimes it's very difficult to please everyone. Anyway, before we move on to the details, I once again went back to the top part of the painting to darken up the areas here as well. So I added even more black color to these trees and leaves to kind of match the darker look in the ground. Then I started to actually work on this pathway part that we have largely ignored before this point. So I made some lighter brown color and started to paint these rocks, or I don't know what these might be. And after the brown color, I used a much darker black-brown mixture to add a bit of shadow under each of these rocks to make them more dimensional. We're gonna add some highlights to these shapes later as well and focus on the sides of this pathway, but before that I wanted to finally start adding some more details to this painting. So pretty much everything we've done up until this point has been just the background texture, and now it's time to finally start adding these sharper shapes that will fill up the painting a little bit more. So I started to paint these turquoise flat looking leaf shapes. I think I saw a picture with some type of leaves like this. They are not gonna look very pretty at this point, but I do think that they will look much better by the end. Then I mixed a little bit more of a green shade and started to add these grass strokes. The key to have these extremely thin strokes is to use the very tip of your painting brush and create very light and quick strokes. I know it might be a little bit tricky in the beginning, but I promise you practice will make it much better. I think this was also a point where I took a break from this painting, and if you don't want your gouache paints to dry, you can spray them with a little bit of water and then put a plastic wrap around your palette. This of course doesn't really work if you have a flat palette, but it really keeps the colors wet. I'd say at least for around 1 day, so you can leave your painting and come back to it the next day. We will continue with these ground details later as well, but to get a better idea of where to place these stronger highlights, I thought it was smarter to start adding some of these glimmery effects here first. Well, actually first I began to paint these black hanging leaves because my idea was to have these hanging ropes and leaves from this big curvy tree. But I don't think that these black leaves are gonna look like much at this point. However, I do think that they added a nice dark background for the lights that we're gonna paint next. So this is the point where I finally took the yellow color and mixed a bunch of white with it to make it even lighter. And then we're gonna start painting these light dot ropes hanging from this big tree. I'm also starting to add some highlights to the edges of the tree branches that will be directly highlighted by these light ropes. And I know these white lines look pretty harsh at this moment, but we are gonna blend them out a little bit later. So I was trying to add some variation here, so keeping some of the ropes shorter and closer together, making some dots a little bit larger than the others. And then I also wanted to paint a few light yellowy flowers on the crown part. I wanted these yellow flowers to also have a little bit of a glimmery effect. So we're gonna focus a lot of the lighter crown details around these flowers. Before that, however, I added some more light dots here and there that will add a little bit of a magical appearance to the forest. So now we'll start adding some more highlights to these crown details. And again, I started from these flat leaf-like shapes. So I mixed this much lighter turquoise color by adding more white to my previous mixture and then focusing these lighter highlights to the leaves close to the yellow flowers. Then we'll start adding some more grass strokes, which will be a little bit lighter and brighter than what we did earlier. And I'm also using some different tones of green here. I also wanted to add some turquoise dots towards the sky part because I just love the magical look it creates. So we have finally arrived to the final detailing phase where I'm just going over these detailed areas and adding more and more small highlights and shadows. So we're first blending those highlighted lines in the trees and adding some more dot-like texture to the ground. I also felt like we needed a little bit more shadows around some of these lighter grass and flower areas to add more contrast and impact to the light sources. Then I also added some further highlights to the pathway and some shadows and grass strokes around it. Then the final little edits I wanted to do here were to intensify some of these hanging dot ropes and add a few more of them. So I decided to add a few ones also to the darker side of this bigger tree, and I added a little bit of highlight to the branches around those spots as well. But that's pretty much it for this dark forest painting. I really hope you enjoyed watching and found this painting process interesting. Also, please let me know if this is a picture that you would be interested in seeing in my shop. To be honest, when I started this painting, it was not my intention to create a painting that I would add to the shop, but since I ended up spending way more time on this than I thought, I could very well scan this image and edit it a little bit further on the computer and add it to the shop together with the other spring launch items around mid-March. So let me know your thoughts, but other than that, I think that's it for today. If this was your first time around here and you'd like to stay tuned for more, definitely consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye!